The worst thing that can happen to a movie is that it flops at the box office. Good reviews are nice and all, but they don't keep the lights on. And as the system has shifted to a heavier focus on blockbusters, the chance of a movie flopping and that flop being disastrous greatly increase. While few of these flops are enough to, say, destroy a studio, it's not easy to suffer a $100 million or $200 million loss. In this video, I want to take a look at some of the biggest film flops ever and why they flopped. Whether it was because of terrible marketing, a lack of interest, or something else, each of the following movies gave their respective producers and distributors quite the bruising. I had to decide whether to go with John Carter or The Marvels first, because while John Carter might be the biggest flop when adjusted for inflation, it's a lot squishier to determine as opposed to The Marvels, which lost around $237 million. For simplicity's sake, The Marvels is the best place to start. It doesn't really matter either which way because, both ways, Disney has the biggest flops and the biggest hits in film history. The 33rd film in the MCU, The Marvels is a greatest hits of all the biggest issues that Marvel has had since Avengers Endgame. First, there's everything you need to keep up with. As someone who's seen every Marvel movie in theaters, and besides Daredevil, and a few episodes of Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, has not kept up with the TV stuff at all, the watchword for me was confusion. I wouldn't say I have superhero fatigue, but I don't want my movie or TV watching habits to be like homework. I just want to watch the movie and have that be it. But for The Marvels, it's not enough that I saw Captain Marvel or Avengers Endgame. No, I would have had to have seen WandaVision, Ms. Marvel, and Secret Invasion as well. That leads to another issue, the number of characters you need to juggle, which means none of them get the screen time that they need. In addition to the 3 stars, Brie Larson, Teyonah Parris, and Iman Vellani, we ended up with another poorly done Marvel villain. There was also Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury, which, while always fun to see, only took more screen time from an already oversaturated cast. Disney CEO Bob Iger would ascribe its issues to COVID, saying, quote, "There wasn't as much supervision on the set, so to speak, where we have executives really looking over what's being done day after day after day," end quote. Marvel's incursion on their director's creative freedom has already been documented and resulted in an entertaining but ultimately flat series of movies except for a few bright lights. Despite that, Iger also said that it got to the point where they were disappointed when a movie didn't break $1 billion. That leads to a more insidious issue. The Marvels is a movie born of hubris more than anything else. Not bad marketing, not complication, not lack of supervision. Those are all factors, but the biggest issue is ego. It's an unreasonable follow-up to 2019's Captain Marvel, which I enjoyed and which made $1.1 billion at the box office. The Marvels, meanwhile, pulled in just $206 million against its massive $275 million budget, suffering a $925 million decline from Captain Marvel. With the Marvels, Disney and Marvel seem to think that so long as a property carried the Marvel brand, it would do numbers at the box office. But that's only true for as long as there's a narrative through line that shows that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. The post-Endgame movies lack that through line, needlessly convoluting themselves. Movies like Eternals, Thor: Love and Thunder, and Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania squandered interesting premises, while they've seemingly refused to follow up on Shang-Chi, one of the few good post-Endgame movies. For me, the redeeming factor of The Marvels was Iman Vellani, who plays Kamala Khan and Ms. Marvel. Vellani effortlessly stole the show and seemed like she had a blast working on it. Her character was charming and enjoyable and brought an infectious joy to an otherwise stolid movie. The movie would have been a lot better if it was all Vellani all the time, or at most co-starring her and Brie Larson to capture the joy and pain of working with one's heroes. It's unfortunate that the rest of the movie didn't match her enthusiasm. 2012 was a landmark year for Disney. Not only did they have the highest grossing movie of the year, The Avengers, but they also had the year's biggest flop and, adjusted for inflation, perhaps the biggest flop in film history. John Carter, which might have lost as much as $265 million when marketing is factored in. John Carter is an adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1912 novel, A Princess of Mars. Now, A Princess of Mars is an extremely influential sci-fi book. It's likely that every sci-fi and fantasy author and director of the last 75 years has been influenced by it. It's about a Confederate soldier, John Carter, who finds himself transported to Mars, which is inhabited by green Martians and red Martians, and where he falls in love with Dejah Thoris, a red Martian that's also the princess of Helium, a Martian kingdom. The movie had a rough ride even getting into production. A lot of people have tried to adapt A Princess of Mars over the years, but no one has gotten it right quite yet. Disney was no different. They tried once in the 80s and abandoned it before restarting it in the late 2000s. Andrew Stanton, who directed Finding Nemo and WALL-E for Pixar and was a fan of Burroughs, was brought on to direct his first live-action feature. The pitch was simple, quote, Indiana Jones on Mars, end quote, which, on paper, should have worked. Unfortunately, Stanton seemed to stack the deck against himself. First, he wanted lesser-known actors. The titular John Carter was played by Taylor Kitsch, who had a moment in the early 2010s. Things were looking pretty bright for him in Hollywood, but 2012 pretty much destroyed his career. John Carter was just his first flop. Battleship, which came out just a couple of months later, also got destroyed at the box office, as did Savages, which was made on a smaller budget. His co-star, Lynn Collins, who played the female lead, Deja Thoris, suffered roughly the same fate thanks to John Carter. Cheapening out on actors might have been a ploy to save on salaries because Stanton also brought Pixar's expensive movie-making style to bear on the movie. In Don C. Chmielewski and Rebecca Keegan's 2012 article, The Planets May Not Be Aligned for John Carter, written for the LA Times, they detail some of the issues that went into John Carter's flop. On the movie, quote, Stanton was crafting a complicated interplanetary story with live-action period elements and more than 2,000 visual effects shots delivered by 4 companies, end quote. Coordinating that many shots across that many companies is expensive already, but adding to that was the ridiculous number of reshoots. In Stanton's words, quote, I've been taught how to make a movie work really well that's had 4 reshoots, end quote. Never mind those small reshoots though. Stanton supposedly reshot nearly the entire movie twice. He tried to abide too much by the Pixar style of shooting instead of taking advice from the live-action crew. At Disney, reshoots are now built into the process, but it used to be the case that they were a sign of major trouble. John Carter didn't suffer from any horrible stunt accident, or people walking off set, or tremendous creative differences, or some other drama. It was just indecisiveness. The LA Times article highlighted the issues surrounding the movie's marketing as well. About the only memorable part was an orchestral version of Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. Otherwise, quote, Disney's marketing campaign has done little to stoke enthusiasm, end quote. They didn't promote the movie at Comic-Con the prior year either, instead opting to stick with showing it at D23. They also made the foolish choice to rename it John Carter instead of going with the original title, A Princess of Mars. A movie is like a ship, but Andrew Stanton turned out to be the wrong captain. Not because he's a bad director, far from it. He also directed Finding Dory and the upcoming Toy Story 5. The SS John Carter just turned out to be the wrong kind of ship for him to steer. After its flop, and as highlighted in the LA Times article, Disney would, quote, focus its investments on potential franchise films that could also be exploited by its television networks, consumer products groups, and theme parks, end quote. 2013's The Lone Ranger is the third of the catastrophic Disney flops. Not all of them, dear God, no. There's 2022's Strange World, which lost $197 million, 1999's The 13th Warrior, produced by Touchstone Pictures, which was a label of Disney, which lost as much as $236 million when adjusted for inflation, and 2011's Mars Needs Moms, which lost as much as $195 million when adjusted for inflation. But one can only cover so much Disney and so many meh movies. The Lone Ranger is at least interesting, if only for how badly it did critically and commercially. Johnny Depp, who had a good relationship with Disney thanks to the wild success of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, was selected to play Tonto in 2008, while director Gore Verbinski was brought on in 2010. Armie Hammer was brought on to play the Lone Ranger in 2011, which is also when the movie started running into issues, namely the budget. Disney CEO Bob Iger was concerned about the size of the budget, which eventually topped out at $250 million, and which was more than the Avengers a year prior. In order to reduce the budget, Depp, Hammer, Verbinski, and producer Jerry Bruckheimer took a 20% haircut on their upfront salaries, probably hoping to make it back on the back end. That did not happen. It's worth mentioning that part of the budget reduction also included significant script changes. From a Variety article, quote, some of the script's bigger sequences were consolidated and some plot points excised, including scenes with supernatural coyotes that would have been too expensive to digitally create, end quote. Now, it's possible those supernatural coyotes might not have added much to the movie, but it would have been neat. Unfortunately, the shoot was not as simple as John Carter. See, all the issues with John Carter's extravagant costs were self-inflicted by director Andrew Stanton. Not so for The Lone Ranger, which had to deal with external issues. According to Variety, quote, the shoot itself was hit with delays caused by rain and snowstorms, wildfires, 70-mile-per-hour winds, 100-degree plus temperatures, an outbreak of chickenpox among the crew, and the death of a stuntman, end quote. Even after saving all that money, they were right back where they started. Some even joked that the production was cursed. Unfortunately, so were the critical reviews and the box office. People were aware of the many issues and the fact that it got delayed a few times. The movie got blasted, making a paltry $260 million. I do take some issue with Rotten Tomatoes consensus, which reads, quote, Armie Hammer and Johnny Depp make for an appealing pair of leads, but they're not enough to make up for the Lone Ranger's bland script, bloated length, and blaring action overkill, end quote. Bland script? Yes. Bloated length? Debatable. Blaring action overkill? Certainly not. It's one of the best parts of the movie and worth the price of admission. Bruckheimer, Verbinski, Hammer, and Depp took issue with what they saw as unfair criticism. According to Hammer, quote, if you go back and read the negative reviews, most of them aren't about the content of the movie, but more what's behind it, end quote, while Bruckheimer added, quote, I think they were reviewing the budget, not reviewing the movie, end quote. The movie is an enjoyable watch and a feast for the eyes, totally deserving of the nominations it got for Best Makeup and Hairstyling, as well as Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards. Matt Zoller Seitz, writing for Roger Ebert, said it was, quote, violent and sweet, clever and goofy, end quote, and likely to be reevaluated in the future. Now is probably too soon, but I don't think he's wrong. I want to take a break from the Disney films to talk about a movie that wasn't as big of a flop as either The Marvels or John Carter or The Lone Ranger, but an infinitely better film than all of them. That, of course, is Blade Runner 2049. The movie cost as much as $185 million to make and pulled in just $277 million at the box office. With an estimated break-even of $400 million, it meant that it still likely lost 9 figures. Perhaps it shouldn't have come as a surprise. After all, 1982's Blade Runner suffered a similar fate. The $30 million movie made just $42 million at the box office and would see director Ridley Scott getting fewer offers for a few years. He didn't even get the call to direct Aliens. He only found out about it through James Cameron. But Blade Runner was extremely influential, and it's considered one of the best movies of the 1980s. It changed how people think about sci-fi and helped define the visual style of cyberpunk. But unlike other sci-fi movies like Empire Strikes Back a couple of years before, E.T. the same year, or Terminator a couple of years later, it was a bit slower and more thoughtful, asking and posing deeper questions. Critics didn't get it at the time, and it took a few years to find its audience. Blade Runner 2049 had similar and some newer issues. For one, it wasn't really a sequel that people were asking for. Blade Runner found its audience, to be sure, but it didn't quite have the critical mass that Star Wars has retained over the decades to drive people to the theaters in droves. I think the studio expected that because Blade Runner had built up such a dedicated audience over the decades, its influence seeping into literally everything, that maybe they achieved that critical mass. Well, they were wrong. Also, the two movies were 35 years apart. That's a hell of a long time. And unlike Top Gun Maverick, which grossed nearly $1.5 billion at the box office, Blade Runner 2049 was rated R, further limiting its audience. Another issue was just how different it was from the popular sci-fi fare, namely the MCU movies and Star Wars. Blade Runner 2049 was darker, a slower burn, and clocked in at 2 hours and 43 minutes. Both Blade Runner movies reward multiple viewings, but they do feel like longer watches than other films. They take time to chew the scenery and beauty and aren't frenetically edited. But the slower pace also means that it's unlike most blockbusters, which rely on fast edits and quips to move things along. 2049, meanwhile, demands and rewards attention. There's a reason it was nominated for Best Production Design, Best Sound Editing, and Best Sound Mixing at the Academy Awards, and took home the win for Best Cinematography, courtesy of Roger Deakins, and Best Visual Effects, courtesy of John Nelson, Gerd Nefzer, Paul Lambert, and Richard R. Hoover. Director Denis Villeneuve was well aware of the precarious position that the movie put him in, and the criticism he invited when attempting the project. He called attempting Blade Runner 2049, quote, walking on sacred territory, end quote, and thought that it was sacrilegious to even attempt it. Still, it would have been hard for anyone to do a better job than he did. While the movie didn't break even at the box office, it only burnished the Blade Runner mythos as a titanic work of art, one that still has plenty to give. It's hard not to respect the Wachowski siblings. Not only did they give us The Matrix, which, similar to Blade Runner 17 years before it, helped redefine sci-fi, cyberpunk, and action movies, but they also take some of the biggest risks in filmmaking history. Similar to Disney, you could take a number of their movies to put on the list of the biggest flops. Speed Racer in 2008, Cloud Atlas in 2012, and Jupiter Ascending in 2015 all lost a bunch of money. Now, it would be correct to say Speed Racer and Jupiter Ascending probably lost more money than Cloud Atlas, but in the vein of Blade Runner 2049, Cloud Atlas is the much more interesting flop and still likely lost somewhere on the order of high 8 or low 9 figures. Cloud Atlas was an adaptation of David Mitchell's 2004 novel of the same name and clocked in at 2 hours and 52 minutes. The movie takes place across 6 eras between the years 1849 and 2321 in what can either be described as an ambitious attempt at interweaving disparate narratives or a disjointed mess that leaves you going, what the hell? The truth is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, which also helps explain why the movie bombed. People really had no idea what to make of it. While the runtime and editing got some critique, most agreed that the action, ambition, and style on display was top-notch. Rotten Tomatoes critic consensus captured it quite well, quote, "Its sprawling, ambitious blend of thought-provoking narrative and eye-catching visuals will prove too unwieldy for some, but the sheer size and scope of Cloud Atlas are all but impossible to ignore," end quote. Roger Ebert gave it a perfect 4 out of 4 and called it one of the most ambitious films ever made, watched it multiple times, and hailed it as one of the best films of 2012. Conversely, Henry Barnes at The Guardian said that, quote, "At 172 minutes, Cloud Atlas carries all the marks of a giant folly, and those unfamiliar with the book will be baffled," end quote. In addition to the runtime, poor marketing contributed to the bomb. To be fair, that's to be expected. It's difficult to market a film set during a single time period, let alone 6. It also didn't help that the movie opened during Hurricane Sandy. I recall this for a fact because, living in Manhattan at the time, I lost power in my area. However, the theaters on 42nd Street just so happened to have electricity and running water, meaning I spent a few blissful days just watching movies after most of the storm had passed. Despite the movie bombing, one thing that's for certain is that everyone who worked on the movie had a blast. Tom Hanks said, quote, "It's the only movie I've been in that I've seen more than twice," end quote. Hugh Grant said that he thought it was amazing and that the Wachowskis, quote, "are the bravest filmmakers in the world," end quote, and had high praise for them years after the fact. Even David Mitchell, the author, was impressed with what the directors had achieved. As Stanley Kubrick could attest, sometimes the author of the work doesn't always like the final film. Not Mitchell, who called the movie magnificent and was impressed at how well they had adapted it from the novel to the screen. The movie never got a fair shake in theaters and bombed like their subsequent directorial features, but it's no less the worse for it. Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within was a 2001 movie directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the Final Fantasy franchise. Sakaguchi also produced Final Fantasy VII, which was a massive critical and commercial success and gave him free rein to do whatever he wanted. Both fortunately and unfortunately, he wanted to make a movie. The Spirits Within was a massive money sink. Made on a budget of $137 million, it grossed just $85 million at the box office. The nominal loss was $94 million, or $162 million when adjusted for inflation. It's one of the biggest bombs in movie history and one of the biggest animated bombs. The Spirits Within is, similar to Cloud Atlas, an ambitious film and one of those movies that one wishes did better than it did. It was a huge leap forward in what was possible with animation at the time. Before it, you could spot an animated movie a mile away. No one would mistake movies like The Lion King, My Neighbor Totoro, or Toy Story for being quote-unquote realistic movies. But The Spirits Within wanted to change what it meant to be an animated film. It was the first serious, big-budget attempt at bringing photorealistic animation to the big screen for a long period of time. Movies like Terminator 2: Judgment Day and Jurassic Park had some measure of photorealistic CGI, but it was mixed with live action. But Sakaguchi wanted Spirits Within to be all animated all the time, and he wanted to get as close to photorealistic as the technology would allow. Successors like Beowulf and The Polar Express will try to replicate its example to varying degrees of success, but it wasn't until 2019's The Lion King from Disney that a photorealistic movie really broke through and looked indistinguishable from live action. But The Spirits Within made all of that possible. It was ambitious, but alas, ambition is expensive as hell. The movie took 4 years to make, and of that, the first 18 months was spent writing software while the remaining time was used for animation, which could be tedious. While motion capture was used for the most part, it wasn't perfect. Animators had to go in and fine-tune some of the animations or do them from scratch. According to John Edgar Park, writing for Animation World in 2001, quote, "The film itself is composed of 1,327 shots. There are 141,964 frames, each of which took anywhere from 15 minutes to over 7 hours per frame to render. The average was around 90 minutes. Square Pictures stored 10 terabytes of 3D and 5 terabytes of 2D artwork. The roughly 200 people who worked on the film contributed about 120 person-years of work, end quote. As a result of its ambition, length, and the necessity to get it out there, the animation wasn't perfect and the motion capture did not look as good as the contemporary Gollum from The Lord of the Rings. The look ran into the same issue that most movies with photorealistic animation do. The uncanny valley effect, or when something looks human, but there's something about it that's just a little off that makes you feel icky. The problem has yet to be solved, as humans will, given the time, usually discern real from fake. The Spirits Within, unfortunately, had a lot of things going against it. First, producing a video game and directing a movie are two wildly different things, and success in the one does not guarantee success in the other. At this point, video game movies also weren't the billion-dollar hits that they are now. And while the visuals were certainly spectacular for the time, the story seemed unable to hold up. The movie would shutter Square Pictures and delay the merger between Square and Enix. It dealt a financial blow to Square, which suffered its first financial loss since its foundation in 1986. And it led to Sakaguchi leaving the company and spending some years demoralized before starting his own game studio, Mistwalker. Still, the movie is historically important. Roger Ebert put it very well in his 3.5 out of 4-star review of the film, quote, "In reviewing a movie like this, I am torn between its craft elements and its story. Final Fantasy is a technical milestone, like the first talkies or 3D movies. You want to see it whether you care about aliens or space cannons. It exists in a category of its own, the first citizen of the new world of cyberfilm," end quote. A flop, yes, but an important one. Some massive flops suck, some are misunderstood, and some deserved better than they got. Still, almost all of them are, in their own way, interesting. One thing is for certain though, as budgets keep increasing, so will the number of flops.